This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy. Chapter 31, 1920, Topside Transition Year. The year of incredible price rises, good times, boom times, land and commodities trading at record levels. As always, the time arrives when almost all available property is mortgaged, and there is no way people can borrow new money into existence to support high prices. Prices then decline. In 1920, prices peaked and started down. Farmers were caught in the commodity decline and began to suffer. The stock market bottomed out and started up. This always comes as a shock to those who look for everything to go up together and come down together. When prices are rising, companies use up most of their profits buying raw materials, which are ever increasing in price, and paying labor, which is ever increasing in its demands. When prices start down, companies which are not weighted down by debt can buy raw materials at ever lower prices, hire labor more cheaply, and make a profit in selling the finished product almost every time, if they're fortunate. Of course, this too has an end to it. Prices can only go so low, and then another set of problems arise. The wholesale price index also peaked out and rapidly started down. 1920 was a year which was far more important than the much talked about 1929. 1921, the stock market started rising. Unemployment reached 22%. A number of corporations which were heavily in debt went under, and the M2 money supply dropped by minus 10%. Real estate got sticky, and in places like Florida, it plunged. There was another milestone passed in 1921. The total number of banks, which had been growing year after year, peaked at 31,076. This event is of such importance that it has been delayed until now. The article in the next chapter is from Portfolio's Investment Advisory Newsletter, number 84, and is printed with permission. Section 10, The World Today, Chapter 32, Bank Wars. In the 1920s Turkey shoot, over 16,000 banks folded or were merged out of existence. This story began more than 200 years ago. In 1780, the United States had 2 interest banks. Prior to this time, it had none. The people didn't believe in interest since it was forbidden by their Christian religion. By 1800, perhaps 20 of these banks had come into existence. It was during this 20-year period that events occurred which shaped the history of the country. These events caused the war between the states, the rapid settling of the West by bankrupt Easterners, and World War II. These 2 decades made inevitable everything that has followed since. 1780. The forcible ejection of the British and their banking activities left a vacuum in America. Immediately, a rush was underway to fill that vacuum. Alexander Hamilton presented 3 arguments for a central bank. He wanted to do to the brand new United States what the Bank of England had done to England, and he wanted it done by himself and his backers, who were reputed to be the Rothschilds and the Bank of England. 1781. The Private Bank of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia was replaced by the Bank of North America. It was later absorbed into the Pennsylvania Company for insurance in 1923. Cornwallis surrendered the British Army at Yorktown, Virginia. Events moved fast. 1784. Bank of New York was founded, a Hamilton creation. Oldest existing commercial bank in the country. The Massachusetts Bank also formed. Virginia settled her counties of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and spun them off as states. Virginia, an unwilling slave state, also saw that a law was passed prohibiting slavery in these new states. 1786. First major economic depression brought on by these new banks lending 10 and demanding 11 in payment. Banks foreclosed debtors, forcing them into poverty, and debtors' prison. The state of Massachusetts had heavy debt and levied heavy taxes on its citizens to pay interest on this debt. This was exactly the same thing England had been doing. It ruined many of her own farmers. Led by Captain Daniel Shea, 2,000 of these desperate men seized Worcester, Massachusetts, and other towns. This uprising threatened the establishment of interest banking in North America. The governor of Massachusetts quickly took the field against the rebels. Shea's rebellion was suppressed on February 27, 1787. The interest system won its first victory. 1787. The Constitution was fittingly put together in Philadelphia, the home of the Bank of North America. Next, New York City, the home of the Bank of New York, was proclaimed the temporary capital of the country. 1789. Washington was elected president. In a move toward conciliation, he appointed Alexander Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury. This put the fox in the hen's house, and it doomed Washington's beloved Virginia to be devastated by a war of assimilation 71 years later. 1791. First Bank of the United States was chartered. This was a private bank to which all the government's money was entrusted. Its charter was for 20 years and was also Hamilton's creation. Representative James Madison of Virginia on February 2nd opposed the bank because he said that it would 1. Banish precious metals through inflation of the money supply, and 2. Result in runs on banks and bank failures. When its successor, the Second Bank of the U.S., went bankrupt 50-odd years later, it was discovered that 64% of the bank's 25,000 shares were owned by foreigners, mostly British. Friends of the Bank of England had been active in America. Madison had been right. 1792. History books say that Hamilton's influence shortened the panic that calling $11 in loans when there were only $10 in existence had caused. History also says that the victors write the history books. 1794. Heavy taxes needed to pay interest on state debts caused farmers to revolt in western Pennsylvania. George Washington did what his economic advisor told him to do. He crushed the rebellion. Creditors called the uprising the Whiskey Rebellion as a put-down. It was a tragic time for the farmers of America, another victory for the interest banking. 1824. The Boston Revolt. In Boston, Massachusetts, a number of small private banks had been hurriedly thrown together and were eager to sock it to the public. In addition to lending $10 for 11, they issued paper money. They also threatened the big banks by underbidding them for business. The big banks retaliated by having laws passed requiring gold to be given to anyone presenting a paper banknote to an issuing bank. The big banks were too big for retaliation. This effectively brought banking rebels to heel, and they have continued to be obedient ever since. Today, the present policing organization keeping surveillance over the smaller banks is called the Federal Reserve System. It is a power unto itself, refusing to allow itself to be audited since its official creation in 1913. The Boston Revolt was actually a civil war within the new banking system. It was the third and last revolt against the big interest banks in the Northeast. Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and the Boston Revolt, 2 attempts with force and 1 financial, all 3 defeated. This was how the Northeast was secured. Conquest of the North, Central, and South. For the next 61 years, the energies of the new banking system were directed into the north-central part of the country, into the former Virginia counties of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. After this was accomplished, the stone wall to interest expansion presented by the plantation system of the mother state Virginia and the rest of the South was broken by armed force in 1861. The arrogant Southerners were brought to heel in the same manner as their brother farmers in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania earlier. The boom in banks. 1812. By the time the War of 1812 ended, there was more than 250 banks in existence. In addition, there was one notable subtraction, which was a first. 1809. The Farmers Exchange Bank of Gloucester, Rhode Island, went broke. This was the first of the thousands which were to follow. 1834. The fight between President Jackson of the U.S. and Biddle of the Second Bank of the U.S. has been omitted because the issue was not interest bank versus interest-free bank, but merely who was going to control the country. Jackson won and delayed the complete bank takeover of the country for years. He was tough. Biddle's bank bankrupted in 1841. 1837. Crisis of 1837. In May of this year, all banks suspended specie payment. 600 banks broke down. New interest banks were forming so rapidly that the decrease really doesn't show up in the history chart. For the next 84 years, through depressions and booms, interest banks grew like cancer cells. Even in the awful depression which bottomed in 1896, the total number of banks increased almost yearly. Businessmen, farmers, and workers, caught in the meshes of the interest contract, bankrupted by the tens of thousands pouring riches into the coffers of banks holding the contracts. This was the time when starvation stalked the land, and banking tycoons and their cronies were building mansions in every town. Look at the dates on the big mansions in your town. You will find that most were built between 1880 and 1910. It was also in this period that the farmers began to give up the impossible struggle with interest compounding debt and started to move to the cities, as happened in the identical same manner in Rome 2,000 years ago. The hills that used to be farmed in New England and the South have gone into pasture and bush. The Roman parallel. At the peak of her might, Rome invaded the land of Old Persia. She levied a fine of 20 million. If the Persian cities did not pay, Rome would raise them as she had Corinth. Persia had no money. Roman bankers generously lent 20 million. In a few short years, principal plus interest made the debt grow to 40 million. Interest payments to Rome annually were from 2 to 4 million. This compared with the annual tribute of only 1.5 million to the imperial Roman government. The bankers were raking off more than the state. Money is power. The borrower is servant to the lender. This 2 to 4 million annual interest payment represented a lot of power to the banking class of Rome. A dictator came to power in Rome and declared 2,000 of these wealthy Roman banker knights traitors and confiscated their wealth, the loans. This was done in the name of the state. The dictator ran the state. Now he owned the loans and the interest. For a time, he became a super banker. This is the type of power play which was missed by the masses in Rome. It was again missed by the masses during the 1920s turkey shoot in America. The birth of the giant bank. 1913. In America, the business of guaranteed profits whetted the appetites of greedy people all over the nation to get into banking. The number of banks grew to 27,285. Instead of stamping out these new banks, the Northeast giants encouraged their growth in spite of the fact that when a pie is cut too many ways, no one gets a big slice. There were too many banks, and most of them were not making as much money as they could have if there were fewer banks. To reclaim their advantage when the time was ripe, the big banks instructed the politicians to create a central regulatory commission run by the same banks. The Federal Reserve was created. This new creation acted much in the same manner as the Roman dictator had earlier. A lot of regulations governing banks were issued. The act bringing the Federal Reserve System into existence was co-authored by Senator Carter Glass, whose house is 3 blocks from where this article is being written. 1921. 7 years later, the ballooning total of banks peaked at 31,076, and the big banks snapped the trap shut on the small banks. Bank failures, shotgun mergers, and consolidation of assets began under the watchful eye of the Federal Reserve. In assuming its place as the new banking dictators, the Federal Reserve issued numerous regulations. The topside transition year of 1920 put an end to good times when commodity prices peaked and plunged, causing the bankruptcy of tens of thousands of businesses. This hurt banks that held the worthless loans. As planned, it caused them to violate rules and regulations of the Federal Reserve. Banks failed by the thousands. These massive failures had the happy effect of reducing the total number of banks and increasing the assets of the survivors. There are a few surviving banks that did not profit tremendously by the closing down of their competition. There are a few hamlets in the Virginia which do not contain an old boarded-up bank, a trophy of the 1920s turkey shoot. 1933. There were only 14,771 banks left. 16,305 had bitten the dust in 11 years. Feeling that enough banks had failed, the restrictions were lightened and bank failures stopped almost on a dime. This could have been done earlier if there had been a single good reason to do so. As it was, half the competition was gone and their assets now belonged to the survivors. The borrower was still servant to the lender. Half of America was in debt and servant to the 14,000 or so surviving banks. This was much better for the surviving banks who were bigger and more powerful than anything seen before. 1980s turkey shoot. In Rome, the dictator gobbled up the bankers and became a super banker himself for a time. In the 1920s turkey shoot, half the banks gobbled up the other half. I predict that there will be a 1980s turkey shoot where the banks will again gobble up each other, leaving a few, quote, super banks. Commodities are presently plummeting like the 1920s. Businesses are bankrupting in numbers like the 1920s. It seems logical to assume that certain banks owning IOUs from bankrupting businesses will in turn come under pressure. This will cause them to become prey to their stronger bank competitors. In the 1920s turkey shoot, 55% of the banks hit the dust. If 55% of existing banks bite the dust again, it will leave approximately 6,300 banks. This precedent can again be found in Rome, where the dictator came back the second time and took over the assets of 2,000 more banker knights. Perhaps the cycle theory will come into play. It took 73 years from a low of 715 banks in 1847 to the all-time high of 31,076 in 1920. If the 73-year retracement principle holds true, there might be only 715 superbanks left, 73 years from 1920, or in 1993. Each will represent an average of 43 or more other banks' whole assets it will have taken over. Its slice of the interest pie will be bigger than anything we can imagine, since there will be fewer banks to share.